Today is March the 9th. Doesn't God promise us blessing and wealth? Let's find out together as we study Deuteronomy chapter 1. As we read through the Bible in a year, we're going to be looking at the book of Deuteronomy, just the first chapter today. Now, the book of Deuteronomy, in terms of its name, it literally means from Greek, deuteros, second, nomos, law, the second law. It's the second time that the book of the law is mentioned in Scripture, an entire book dedicated to it. By and large, the book of Deuteronomy is Moses at the very end of his life, looking back at what God has done. Deuteronomy can be divided into 4 sections, 3 discourses of Moses, and then a final section that includes a song, a blessing, and the story of Moses' death. The first discourse begins, chapter 1, verse 1. These are the words that Moses spoke to all the people of Israel while they were in the wilderness east of the Jordan River. In verse 3, Moses addressed the people of Israel, telling them everything the Lord had commanded him to say. Now, Moses speaks to them for 4 chapters in that first discourse. The second discourse begins in chapter 4, verse 44. This is the body of instruction that Moses presented to the Israelites. These are the laws, decrees, and regulations that Moses gave to the people of Israel when they left Egypt. Then it goes on to talk about where they were camped. In chapter 5, verse 1, Moses called all the people of Israel together and said, "Listen carefully, Israel. Hear the decrees and regulations I'm giving you today, so you may learn them and obey them." Now that is the longest of the discourses. It extends to chapter 26, the very end of that chapter. Then in chapter 27, verse 1, we have the beginning of the third discourse. Then Moses and the leaders of Israel gave this charge to the people: "Obey all these commands that I'm giving you today." And then he goes on and he gives them specific instructions about what they're supposed to do when they take over Israel. The end of the book of Deuteronomy, that discourse ends in chapter 31, verse 29. Then in 31:30, so Moses recited this entire song publicly to the assembly of Israel. Chapter 32 is Moses' song. Chapter 33 is Moses' blessing for the people of Israel. And chapter 34 is written after Moses' death, about Moses' death. Now let's go back to chapter 1. Deuteronomy 1 consists of a very simple statement starting in verse 6. When we were at Mount Sinai, the Lord our God said to us, "You've stayed at this mountain long enough. It's time to break camp and move on." Moses here begins his review of the history of Israel up to this point. They moved on from Sinai. Starting in verse 9, Moses tells how he appointed leaders over each tribe. In verse 19, he tells us how he sent scouts into Palestine. And starting in verse 26, he tells about how Israel rebelled. They heard the message of the scouts, and they didn't think God could give them the land of Israel. And there's a series of rebellions that Moses talks about then. Israel rebelled against God. Now, we started this devotional with the question, doesn't God promise us blessing and wealth? You know, He had promised Israel the promised land. There is a segment of Christendom that follows what is commonly called the prosperity gospel. Called that not by adherents, but by the opponents of the prosperity gospel. They mention that there are many who simply look at God's promises and say God's promises are for us, but they don't look at the conditions for God's promises. God tells Moses to tell Israel, you rebelled, you disobeyed. Yes, I promised you the land of Israel, but you rebelled against me. Now, it's not simply that obedience leads to God's blessing. It's not so much that when we obey, God then says, well, you did that for me, now I'm going to give you something. It's more that what God commands us to do will result in His blessing on our life. But if we choose not to do it, how can He bless us? The commandments that were given are given to us for our own good, for our health, for our wealth, for our prosperity. If we choose not to obey God, we'll not achieve health, wealth, and prosperity. When we do, we find that something happens. What God commands us to do results in blessing for us. It also results in our learning to live a contented life with what God has given us. That is true wealth. Please like, follow, and subscribe to this devotional on whatever platform you used to listen to it. Email your questions to us at questions@becomehope.com. Tomorrow, we'll ask the question, what is faith?